Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Straight On Till Morning. Neverland. The beach sand was crusty and crunchy and perfectly golden. Well, like in winter Londoners' wildest dreams. Wendy walked inland, watching her feet, her toes curling and spreading in the sensational granules. Halfway to where the shore she met the jungle was a perfectly picturesque shipwreck. She clambered up to it, holding on to the helpfully curvy trunk of a palm tree for balance. With a hand to her forehead, Wendy surveyed her new kingdom. She was perched at what was obviously the edge of a cove, Peg Leg Point, just to the south and west of her. Despite its scurrilicious reputation, the place looking downward pleasant. Tiny waves of sparkling aquamarine lapped the edges and were probably delightful to splash in. Out of sight to the northeast lay Mermaid Lagoon. Off to shore beyond that would be the nefarious Skull Rock, riddled with caves where the pirates hid their loot. Emptying the cove was Crocodile Creek, a wide, sparkling rivulet whose source was somewhere in the Black Dragon Mountains. Michael had named them. There was a wild range in the center of the island that grew bleaker and spikier in the northern or Hyperborean shore. John had named that. While the closer peaks were green and clear, the farther ones were gray and shrouded in mist and mystery. And if one had followed Crocodile Creek toward these mountains, through the pernicious forest and exquisite jungle, both John's touch, one eventually came to the Hangman's Tree hideout for the lost boys. With the very northwest part of the island, there was. Wendy frowned. She couldn't remember, or she had just never described it, or had never dreamed it. Or maybe she had and then had forgotten it. There was something there, but it was like it was wiped from her memory completely. Or maybe the reverse. Maybe it was just unimagined yet, and therefore unexplored. The sun was brilliant lemon yellow, the sky bracing blue. The sea wind whipped Wendy hair into an obligating jig. Her adventure was beginning, her quest to find Peter Pan and save Neverland. But truth be told, while she was living a nightmare, it didn't feel like one. It felt horrible. Not at all the stories she had made up. Neverland wasn't supposed to actually be dangerous. Neverland wasn't supposed to have murderous grown-ups in it. Pirates shooting each other seemed awfully funny in the context of a bedtime tale, but the blood on the deck had been thick and ugly, and she could still hear the way his head had hit the planks. Pirates attacking ladies had never been part of her story, and neither was laundry. And that poor pirate, she whispered, Zane. What was his story? I didn't make it up. What did he mean he was trapped? Neverland was not as simple or as innocent as it had seemed. Wendy would have had to stand her toes while there, but everything looked just as bright and sunny and perfect as ever. Her shadow was as black and strong against the sand and as drawings. Wait, was that a shadow crossing her arms? Wendy looked at her arms, which were first at sides and that snapped to her chest in surprise. Her shadow still kept her arms crossed, and now shaking her head as if to chastise. Then she flexed her hand and curled it into a menacing hook. Shadow puppets without the puppets. There was no doubt at all what she was trying to say. She was upset with what Wendy had done, selling Peter's shadow. Of course, Shadow Wendy was worried about Shadow Peter Pan. Here she was simply free to express it. He didn't want his shadow, Wendy muttered to herself, and her shadow for the 1,000th time. She still didn't believe it. Wendy took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. Whatever, it was done. She had already dealt with some of the results of her actions, would now see the righting the additional wrongs she had created as a result. She would go find Peter. She would save Neverland. And if he was angry with her for what she had done, well, she would deal with it and accept it as fair punishment for her actions. She hopped off a shipwreck and wandered toward the greenery at the end of the cove, trying not to notice or hope their shadow was coming along and behaving, trying to keep her eyes on the jungle ahead. A strange structure untangled itself out of the black background like a hallucination, not part of the natural landscape. It was funny shaped, almost spiritual, green pod-like thing woven from branches of trees and vines. A trellis of flowers hanging down from the opening that served as a door. Wendy was so delighted tears sprang to her eyes. It was her imaginary house. They all have them. Michael wanted his to be like a ship with views of the sea. John had wanted to live like a nomad on the steppes. And Wendy had something that was part of the natural world itself. She tentatively stepped forward, almost swooning at the heavy scent of door floors, languorously lighting on them with few scissor flies, silver and almost perfectly translucent in the glittery sunlight. Their sharp wings made little snickety noises as they fluttered off. Her shadow made a few half-hearted attempts to drag back, pointing to the jungle, but Wendy ignored her, stepping into the hut. She was immediately knocked over by a mad barking thing that leapt from the darkness of the shelter. "Luna!" Wendy cried in joy. The wolf pup, which she had rescued in one of the earliest stories, stood triumphantly on her chest, drawing very visceral, very stinky dog spit on her face. "Oh, Luna, you're real!" Wendy hugged the gray and white pup as tightly as she could and didn't let out a single protest yelp. "Although, you're bigger than I imagined," Wendy said, thoughtfully sitting up. "I thought you were a puppy." Indeed, the wolf was approaching formidable size, although she was obviously not quite a full-grown and still had large puppy jaws. She was at least 4 stone, and her coat was thick and fluffy. Yet she pranced back and forth like a child, not circling the sky slope Wendy imagined adult views. "You're not a stupid little lapdog, are you?" Wendy whispered, nuzzling into her face on the wolf's fur. Luna chuffed happily and gave a white, big, sloppy lick across the cheek. "Let's see what's inside the house." As the cool interior embraced her, she felt a strange shout of relief, and welcome was the only way she could describe it. She was home. The interior was small and cozy. Plate, sweet-smelling rush mats across the softened door floor. The rounded walls made shelves difficult, so macrate ropes hung from the ceiling, cradled half logs or flat stones that displayed pretty pebbles, several beautiful eggs, and what like a teacup made from a lantern assembled from translucent pearly shells sat a real cherry writing desk, intricately carved and entirely out of place with the rest of the interior. Wendy picked up one of the pretty pebbles in wonder, turning it this way and before putting it in her pocket. "This is me," she breathed. She had never been before, but it felt so secure and so right it might not have been anything but her home, her real home. Here there was no slight tension of her back as she waited for 4 steps to intrude, for reality to wake her from her dreams. There was nothing in here to remind her of the perilous days, sad or happy ones. There was no window looking out in the grey world of London. There was just peace and the scent of the mats and the quiet droning of insects and waves inside. "Neverland is a mishmash of us, of me," she said slowly. "It's what we imagine and dream of, including the dreams we can't remember. What an odd thought. Zane was right. It is an island that knows me better than I know myself. She could easily envision herself falling asleep on the scented mats. Adventuring was exhausting work. She went back outside instead. Luna leapt beside her. In the bright sunlight, her shadow reappeared, jumping and waving her arms and trying to pull herself away from Wendy again. We are going after Peter Pan, I promise. We will certainly need him against Hook and whatever he has planned. But I really don't know where to even begin looking for him. I suppose we'll just start in that direction. And with that, she strode resolutely ahead, Luna leaping beside her. If she had snuck a look, she might have seen her shadow wag her head back and forth as if making fun of her, then snap back to aping her mistress's movement. If it's a little shower, more reluctantly than they had actually performed. Large leaf plants at the edge of the jungle reflected the sun rather than soaking it up. Their dark green surfaces sparkling white in the sunlight. Some of the smaller ones had literally low-hanging fruit, like jewels from a fairy tale. Behind them was an extremely inviting path into the jungle with giant white shells for stepping stones, and rather than the muggy, disease-filled forest of books that seemed to kill so many explorers. Here the air was cool and pleasant and not too moist, although Wendy could hear the distant tinkle of water from a height. Oh, is that the Tonal Springs or Diamond Falls? Wendy wondered breathlessly. Luna, let's go see. She made herself not race down the path, but moved at a leisurely, measured pace, like an adventuress, sure of herself but wary of her surroundings. And yet, as she wouldn't realize until later, she hadn't thought to grab her stockings or shoes. Those go left in her hut without even a simple goodbye. Everywhere she looked, Wendy found another wonder of Neverland. From the camo sails to the gently nodding heads to the fritillary lilies. She smiled, imagining John as she peered over his glasses, and the snail faded away and into the background in fear, or Michael getting his nose covered in honey-scented lily pollens as he enthusiastically sniffed the pretty flowers. The path continued, winding around a boulder into a delightful little clearing. Sandy but padded here and there were tuffets of emerald green glass and chunks of purple orchids. It was like a desert island of a perfect English meadow. Oh, Luna, isn't it beautiful? Let's go see. With a loud snap of a horse's crop, a white vine snapped across the path at her ankles. Oh, she cried, stumbling forward. But she didn't fall. Another vine was shadowed across her chest. She bounced jarring into and then off of it. This one, too, was ugly and poisonous white, but also slightly sticky. Her dress got caught and so did her throat, already bruised from the impact. Another vine wicked across her so she couldn't fall backward, couldn't escape. What the deuce? She cried, pulling at the vines. They were tough but stretchy and gave rather than broke under her hands. Most of them, slowly now, like they had all the time in the world, coiled around her wrists and ankles. Their vicious snap itched and burned where she struggled, and it was an unhealthy scarlet color. No grown-ups allowed. When the clearing stepped the speaker of these words, a strange little fellow indeed. He was short and fat and as clear and crystalline as a blob of molten glass. His head was misshapen oval on top of his body. A peaked crystal had sat on his head, and he held a sharp shard of a spear. The only color on him at all was his eyes, strangely tan, like two butterscotch candies pressed into the face of a snowman. What Wendy cried indignantly, trying to make understand the harsh words from the otherwise almost adorable figurine. No grown-ups allowed. He turned to face her, but not like a normal person, more like a cross between an owl and some sort of hideous broken toy. His body didn't move. Instead, his head spun smoothly and slowly and farther than it should have until his pupils' eyes locked on hers. Probably it was hard to tell what he was looking at. I am not a grown-up, Wendy sputtered. Let me through. You are 16, the guard said tonelessly. The time of parties and balls and weddings and husbands has commenced. It has not commenced, Wendy said with great dignity. I'm here in Neverland, aren't I? The creature's button eyes didn't move at all, but somehow darkened. You should not be here in Neverland. No grown-ups in Neverland. No fun killers. No bringers of pain and boredom. Get out! Wendy blinked at the ferocity of this ridiculous, strangely terrifying little thing, and leaned forward, ringing tip of its spear perilously close to her stomach. Where on earth had it come from? She had never invented any such monsters. True, adults didn't figure in her stories of Neverland, except as incidental characters, pirates and their ilk, villains and foils. Neverland was supposed to be an island of endless fun for children like her and Michael and John. She never said anything special about prohibiting grown-ups or threatening them with spears. You make the days long. You make the food terrible. You make us go to school. Wendy caught her breath in shock, recognizing the tirade. Michael had horrifyingly told his own father that he hated him. Actually, hated him for making him go to school, where the seats were hard and the lessons worse, and for forcing him to eat their smashed peas. And now, the more she thought about it, the shape of the little creature wasn't unlike something Michael had made out of mud once. Puffin, he'd call it. Yes, the whole scenario felt a bit like Michael, now that she thought about it. A crazed, all-powerful Michael. Now, you listen to me, Wendy began in her best adult voice as if she were speaking to Michael. Bad choice. No more listening, the thing screeched madly, pushing herself as high and far into Wendy's face as it could. You go away now. Forever. To forever place. It reached back its arm to hurl the spear, but Luna had had enough. She threw herself at the horrid thing. Her claws made little tinging noises as they scrapped harmlessly against the crystalline surface. Her teeth slipped from the creature's neck, unable to get a good hold or sink into real flesh. While the creatures were distracted by this, Wendy took the opportunity to try and free herself. She rocked back and forth as hard as she could against the vines, pushing her arms and legs as far as they would go. The tendrils had just enough for her to be able to slip through the handout. She immediately reached into her pocket and grabbed the stone she had taken from her hut. Summoning as much boy chucking rocks in a fountain as she could, Wendy hurled full force at the creature's bulbous crystalline stomach. There was a very satisfying crack. As soon as the tip of the rock hit its skin, giant ragged cracks appeared from the impact point. These rapidly windowed out through the rest of its body, growing like Jack Frost in a window pane, but much, much faster. The thing's mouth hung open, and it dropped its spear. As the fracture spread, it waved its arms back and forth helplessly, like a puppet or a wind-up toy. When the cracks reached its head and became so numerous that its body was almost opaque, the thing exploded. Its glittery bits hurled themselves every which way through the dappled sunlight in a beautiful wave of tinkles and pings one might expect here from baby angels playing harps. Wendy flinched and covered her face, where a shark hit her skin and immediately melted, running down the ground with little droplets of her own blood. Well, she said uncertainly, Luna jumped back and forth over the king's rapidly glittering body, barking last warnings in triumph. Goodness, Wendy added. She let herself experience one more of a shock that forced herself to focus and work at pulling away the vines. They were unpleasant to touch and sticky and itchy, but actually not that hard to wrestle out of what was now the one hand free and no distraction. In fact, they were strangely like a pair of her mother's hose. The three children had once gotten into massive amount of troubles for using the tie-up Michael, for which he was kidnapped by pirates, same color even. Wendy said thoughtfully. Then a little nervously, I suppose that's the last of them? Luna barked, and it sounded like an affirmative response, but Wendy couldn't be certain. I thought it was really going to kill me, Wendy murmured, putting her hand out. The wolf immediately came over and leaned against her friend, sensing her need. Isn't it funny? There was a lot of thoughts in Wendy's head, and none of them were actually funny at all. They weren't even clear or formed or thoughts, just a mishmash of feelings, misgivings, and the unnamed fetal beginnings of ideas. Not a situation she was used to possess a quiet mess of Genesis with no articulation. No pronouncements, aphorisms, or decisions came readily to her tongue. Isn't it funny? She tried again. I thought Captain Hook would be the only real villain here. I mean, the only one I would bump into because of the shadow. And here I have run into a villain I didn't even know existed. One my brother invented as some sort of protector or savior. It's not really clear what the thing was, but all my stories were perfectly clear and straightforward. She looked around the trees and the foliage, the sky and the ground. Though she had brushed it by in quick descriptive phrases to the boys, desert island, tropical plants, venomous but beautiful insects were more solved in more detail than she could ever imagine, down to the tiny veins on the leaves. Apparently Neverland got worked on when she wasn't even talking to the boys. They imagined things on their own, or at least Michael did. To a little child, the idea of no grown-ups allowed to the point of the death might seem reasonable. Funny, even then. Time passed for the three siblings in London, but it didn't in Neverland. Michael's whims and fancies remained the same here as he grew up in London. And these whims seen through older eyes were not harmless. They were diabolical. Neverland isn't just a simple place of childhood dreams, because childhood dreams are never simple. Oh, I do wish I could write down in my little notebook. Her face suddenly constructed into a cartoonish expression of terror when she called a younger John, furious at the Shibo twin, who had tweaked his cheek and giggled at his hat and glasses. Girls shouldn't be allowed to talk at all, he had growled at her, to boys anyhow. How had the rest of the conversation gone? Had he made an exception for his sister? Had Wendy laughed and remonstrated him? More to the point, there was some sort of horrible punishment zone for girls in Neverland devised by the fiendishly clever, but underdeveloped mind of a pre-adolescent John? Luna was watching with giant unblinking eyes as Wendy began working on all these things, far more patient than anyone Wendy had ever known. We must be on our guard, she said, kissing the wolf on her nose. This place is tricky, far trickier than I ever dreamed. The dangers I expected are not the only dangers. Who knows what other stories my little brothers dreamed up? Then again, if Neverland were as simple as my own childish fantasies, there would be no fun at all. Toffee trees. A maze is easily solvable by a simple application of left, right, left. What's the challenge in that? I am 16 now, whether or not I am an adult. I should expect more. Wendy dusted off her dress. The sun had moved slightly in the sky. Ideas and creatures might be eternal in Neverland, but still night came. Time still existed. Decisions had to be made. Luna pranced back and forth in front of her, yelling, low eyes gleaming with excitement, ready to go. But where to? The Mermaid Lagoon, obviously. Peter Pan had visited the mermaids in her stories. Perhaps, maybe she would find him there, or would get help from the friendly locals. But also, mermaids. That would be very helpful in the maritime war waged against apocalyptic pirates. And maybe along the way, Wendy could look for fairies. They were powerful little denizens of Neverland, weren't they? Sure, they could use some magic or something against Hook. Plus, fairies. And what about Lost Boys by Hangman's Tree? Maybe she could find them first. They would know where Peter was. It would be terribly useful. How many stories she had written about their battle with the pirates. And how lovely it would be to have a visit. All these clever things Wendy had invented for them. Like the slides closest down to the hideout from the hollow trees. How marvelous to see it in person. To understand how Neverland had worked out the details. Maybe Peter could even be there already. She gulped a little at the thought. Or maybe the Lost Boys later. Really, the best thing was to round up an army to defend Neverland, wasn't it? She could find Peter and apologize to him and bring up to speed the Hook's nefarious plot. Later. Yes, mermaids first. And then fairies. I wonder where we should go find them. And her question was answered in true Neverland fashion as a fairy dove headfirst into Wendy's chest. That's the end of that chapter. See you later.